study of lessons is how to study the Bible. And last week we began this section, the language of the Bible, and of course from 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. So that tells us studying the Bible is work. It's work. You can't approach it haphazardly and expect to get very much out of it. You've got to really put some effort into it. So we looked at this statement from Oliver Wendell Holmes. And of course, he was a judge, Supreme Court justice, maybe even the Chief Justice at one time, but very famous. And he's talking about words in general, but it applies the same in our study of the Bible. A word is not crystal and unchanging. It is the skin of a living thought and may vary according to the circumstances and time in which it is used. Things change over time. Definitions change over time. The way we use words, the way we understand words change over time. So we've got to do a lot of study to understand how words were used in the past. And a lot of that work has been done for us. Again, a lot of problems developed during the Dark Ages, when education was kind of frowned upon. Only a few were educated, but they were only educated in what certain people wanted them to know. And that's why the rise of the Renaissance really opened up a lot of people's eyes. An effort to study those ancient languages. You know, civilization had really gone downhill. Well, why did the Greeks and the Romans have it so well? Let's go back and let's study why their civilization was better, and we're just facing terrible things like the plague and these constant wars. You know, what's going on? And so the Renaissance, but again, remember, it was called a humanistic movement. And it wasn't necessarily that they were denying God, it's that this false religion had taken over and taken control. So it was an anti-established religion that they were actually fighting against. But they went back to study these things. The invention of the printing press really helped because it made these books, the translation of these books and then the printing of these books cheaper. Anybody could have them in their own language and they could study them. People could be educated as to what could make, you know, and if you read the book 12 Simple Rules for Life, Jordan Peterson, go back and look at some of the foundational work that he does in talking about the book. Did people like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, did they not understand that there were different cultures out there? Did they not travel? When the Greeks took over the ancient world, you know, Alexander the Great, you know, went all these places. Did they not understand that there were different cultures, that there were different ways of looking at things, different religions and such? Well, yes, they did, but that's what the philosophers were then doing. They were examining these things and trying to formulate, well, what makes sense? What makes for a good civilization? Well, that's basically what the Renaissance people were doing. Let's go back and let's look at what makes for a good civilization. What makes people better people? And of course, you even go back to the book of Ecclesiastes. You think about the book of Ecclesiastes and put it in terms of the modern philosophical, psychological movements, sociological movements and such. What does Solomon do? He looks at everything, doesn't he? He looks at all these different cultures. And he tries everything, doesn't he? And does he find anything good? Does he find anything helpful? No. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, right? So what's the conclusion of the whole matter? Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. That's the only thing that's going to help to really put things into perspective. Because if we take this world without God, try to take this world without God, you know what you end up with? Nihilism. What's the use of living? It's just pain and suffering, and you end up dying. There's no hope. God is the only hope. And through those attempts then, again, they didn't have God, for the most part, in this Renaissance movement as the focus of what they were looking at. They were just looking for a better civilization, but because of that, you have the people then saying, scholars then saying, oh hey, if we can do this with the Greek classics, let's start examining the Bible. And let's go back and see what those ancient manuscripts and documents say. And now we've got so much overwhelming evidence. You can find charts that will show you, like, how many copies of some of Plato's work and Aristotle's work and Socrates, Herodotus, all those ancient books that secular historians will look at and say, oh yeah, these are good works. And there might be 2 or 3 copies of stuff 1,000 years after, but yeah, and this is factual. We've got materials from the New Testament that were within 100 years of the New Testament. The actual materials with the Dead Sea Scrolls in some instances, but copies within a couple hundred years, manuscripts, the whole thing within like 200 or 300 years, over 5,000 pieces of evidence. It's overwhelming. So that's where that began also to give us the Bible in our own language. In the English, in the German, in whatever. So there's so much evidence out there about what was written at that time. But again, because the words are not crystal, you got to go back. That's why these scholars have done such a great work in saying, well, here's what it meant when it was delivered. So again, the archaeological evidence, as recently, they're still finding a lot of stuff, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1947, they were discovered 1949, they really start to work on them. So much stuff there, evidence there, to look at what the words meant when they were written. And so there you go, this is where we finished up. The Bible was written in a period of 1,500 years on 3 different continents, 3 different languages, by about 40 different men. We don't know how many, because we don't know how many participated in books like 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. They span a huge period of time. They lived in varying cultures, going through various conflicts, using varying styles of literature. And that's where we begin today. And I just want to hit today on literal language. The Bible uses, and the Bible writers use 2 different types of language, right? Literal and figurative. So we'll just start with the literal because that's the most impressive. The Bible, most of the Bible is written in plain, literal language. And when I say literal, the definition of that is taking words in their usual or most basic sense without, here's a couple words, metaphor or allegory. Metaphor or allegory. That's where you get into the figurative language and Lord willing, we'll get into that next week with a lot of you describing what that is. But to give you an example, Jesus used a lot of parables, didn't he? He taught in parables. Well, there's a reason for that, and we'll get into the reasons for it. But those are metaphors. Allegory is a little bit different. Matthew, Mark, and Luke's filled with parables. John, the Gospel according to John, those mostly allegory. But John writes maybe 30 years after, 20 to 30 years after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And he has a different audience that he's writing to. Okay? So he's not writing, well, we'll get into that later. But you can see a literal. So if I say something to you, let me give you an example here. I guess, I don't know if this is a really good example or not. But I was talking to a man, I think it was Friday. I don't think it was yesterday. It might have been yesterday. But the older I get, the more these days run together. But he's a member of the church, and we talk frequently. I see him just about every day. But we were talking about something specific, okay? And it just something that we were talking about something, then something specific came up, and he says, do you do that at your house? And I said, no, we don't. And he says, well, I suppose since I don't do that, that makes me not a Christian. Since I do that, that makes me not a Christian. I said, whoa, wait a minute. The Bible is very specific on what makes a person a Christian. Would you agree with that? Yeah. So, and we've talked about it a lot, haven't we? What makes a person a Christian? They have to be born again. And once a person is born again, now, by faith, John chapter 1, verse 12, faith gives them the right to become a child of God, but they've got to be born again. They've got to be born of water and spirit. When they do, they become a Christian. But what he was then, he jumped to a conclusion, an unwarranted conclusion then, that because he was doing something that I don't do, that in my sight, apparently, I didn't feel he was a Christian. See what I'm saying? So I had to go back and correct him. No. Here's what makes a person a Christian. If they believe and obey the gospel. That makes them a Christian. Now, as a Christian, what they are doing determines their relationship with God. Okay? So, don't confuse the two. All right? Once a person becomes a Christian, they can reject God, they can turn away from God, they can become an apostate, but they never, it's like we were born human beings, right? Naturally born human beings. Are we ever going to be anything other than human beings? No, but spiritually, we are born again, essentially, to be Christians. Because what we do as human beings is we choose to sin, and that puts us in rebellion to God. And that new birth says, I don't want to be in rebellion to God. I want to be on God's side. But just because I make that choice doesn't mean I stay on God's side. And that's what 1 John's all about, isn't it? If I walk in the light as he's in the light, his blood continues to cleanse me. If I choose not to walk in the light, then I've got a deeper problem. All right? But that doesn't keep me from being a child of God. So, the word, see, he was taking my words and kind of twisting them. And saying, you don't think I'm a Christian. No, that's totally the furthest thing from what I was saying. I don't do what you were asking about. Okay? So, and you can insert quite a number of things in there. Whether they're actual sins, whether they're matters of opinion, right? But why would people go to that point? Okay? Now, if someone had done that with you, what would your response have been? Why do you want to make me feel guilty because you're doing something that I'm not doing? You understand the point there?
Exactly.
Do you understand the point? He was trying to make me feel guilty, when in all actuality, he was probably feeling guilty
Amen.
in the first place, because if he didn't have some doubts, he probably wouldn't have asked that question.
In the first place.
Yeah. So he takes that meaning, the words that he asked the question, I gave an answer, but he takes it, so there was a lack of communication there. And that's the point I'm trying to make, okay? When let's just go on down through this and we'll get to the point, I guess, that I'm trying to make when we're talking about literal language. If he would have understood me literally, taking my words at face value, simply, no, I don't do that. Okay? That was stating a fact, wasn't it? And that's what literal language does. It states facts, names persons and places, relates incidents, issues commandments when we're talking about the Bible, and warnings, draws conclusions, etc. Okay? The literal meaning of a word is that meaning which is given it by those whom it is addressed. No, I don't think that's right. I think it should be, it is, the literal meaning of a word is that meaning which is given it by those by whom it is addressed. So, is it speaker originated, or is it hearer originated? Give me some thoughts.
Some of each. Some of each.
Some of each.
Based on
That's kind of wishy-washy, isn't it, GW?
Well, it's the fact.
It's God's word or his instructions that the speaker interprets and the listener interprets from the speaker rather than doing their own study.
I'm asking. I'm asking. I want your input.
Ask your question again.
Okay. Here's the statement. The literal meaning of a word is that meaning which is given it by those to whom it is addressed. And I say, wait a minute. Shouldn't it be the literal meaning of a word is that meaning which is given it by those by whom it is addressed? Isn't it speaker? The speaker determines what the meaning of the word is, or the hearer determines what the meaning of the word is?
The hearer does.
I think it's both, because you've got the speaker saying one thing and meaning his meaning, but if he's not conveying it correctly, the other one has their meaning to apply to it, and if it's different than the speaker, then there's that miscommunication taking place.
Okay.
If you preach to 100 people, or 1,000 or 10,000, there's 100, 1,000, or 10,000 messages that you put out there, depending on the ear that hears it and how they put it into their lives. Plus one, you. You have a meaning intended, but your intended meaning is not always going to go out and be taken as you perceived it.
It's not like a brick. It's not crystal and unchanging. Oh, that was up there before, wasn't it? Kendra, what do you think?
I think it's, what they're saying about, depends on what they hear, their preconceived notions, what they believe, and how it's presented to them. You're gonna have to, the person hearing's going to already have those belief systems in place, depends on how open-minded they are, or how much they open themselves to listen. I mean,
Okay. Baylor? You're in communications, aren't you? What do you think?
That
What was the question again?
I would say it's the speaker.
I don't understand it either.
I think it's basically the experience of both people involved,
Okay,
because.
I want to get Baylor's.
Uh-oh.
I really want to get his, because he is into communication a lot.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Here's basically where it boils down to. Is it the speaker's responsibility, or is it the audience's responsibility to make sure that the message is plain? Understood.
Make sure the message is understood.
Yeah. Whose responsibility? Speaker or audience?
I'd say it's a bit of both. You know, the speaker has to work on the way that he should deliver it, of course, and then I guess, audience, it's their job to put the pieces together. It's like presenting something for the audience to put in their own. I mean, that's how we learned it in writing for mass media, which is you write it as if you're writing for like an 8-year-old or someone younger, so that then, you know, you can, whatever you have to say, the audience gets more out of, kind of the idea. So you write it simply so that it's easier to understand.
Okay. All right.
I think you get into absolute fact. That is an air conditioner. That's absolute fact.
Literal.
Absolutely. But the perception of each one of us, that's what makes us individuals. Even though we all know that that's an air conditioner, we probably all have different opinions somewhat of why, what, how.
That thermostat works. That thermostat, you know, my wife thinks that thermostat has to be turned up and down all the time. Okay, it's too cold, it's gotta be turned down. It's too hot, it's got to be, no, you leave it right here and it'll automatically go to where you want it.
Not always.
See, you just proved you're always wrong.
Yeah, I know, it comes out that.
What can I say?
Yeah, okay,
I
Lance.
think it's the speaker, because it's, you know, if you tell us, here's what the Bible says, and if we don't go look it for ourselves, and we just take you at face value, so I think the pressure's on the speaker. If you're gonna say something, you better make sure it's correct, and you better make sure that you're very clear, because, I mean, there's been times that I'll give instructions for quizzes and stuff to my students, and then they do the complete opposite, and I'm thinking, I made it very clear, but apparently I didn't.
Okay, GW?
Yeah, I think it's the state of mind that the one that receives it's in at the time that it's spoken. In other words, I had a family situation here not too long ago that caused a pretty hard feeling, because the person wasn't in the same.
I think you were telling us about that. Yeah. Mhm.
Wasn't in the same deal.
Same wavelength, yeah.
Same wavelengths, you know, and so I think it, I think it's the state of mind that receives it, and other words, I had a family situation here not too long ago that caused a pretty hard feeling, because the person wasn't in the same. Wasn't in the same deal. Wasn't in the same wavelength, you know, and so I think it, I think it's the I think it depends on how they feel at the time that they hear the words, because if they have a guilty conscience or something or other, and they hear a word that's perceived in the wrong way, then you know, it's that's what I see. So I think it could be, and that's the reason I said either one, because maybe the way it's presented is not exactly right, and the way that they receive it is not exactly right.
Okay, yeah, so in communication theory, okay, and what Baylor was talking about, you know, got it pretty much right, okay? And what I learned in preaching school, okay, never underestimate the ignorance of your audience,
Yeah.
okay? Try to make it simple, try to make it understandable. Sometimes you can't, okay? So you need to know your audience as much as possible. Yeah, there's air conditioner. We know it's an air conditioner. But if I start telling you how that air conditioner works, if I knew totally how that air conditioner worked, okay? I know it pulls the heat out and puts it outside, and that's what cools the air inside. But just how it does it, do you care? All you care about is it makes it cool in here. You don't need to know everything about it. But see, if I'm trying to give you the technical stuff on it, you don't care. And then if I give you a test on it later, you're not gonna. Okay. So, in the communication process, the literal meaning of a word should be what you believe, what the audience understands that literal meaning of the word to be. But that's why, look what did I do to help you to understand this in the first place?
Yes.
So that we get on the same wavelength. What did I do?
You got us to give our own definitions.
I gave you a definition of literal. Now from that, are we on the same wavelength? Can we understand that? Take the
More
words
so.
in their usual or most basic sense without metaphor or allegory. Air conditioner. Frigid air. There's a Philco back there. Remember when they used to be called Philcos? Some of us probably are old enough to remember that. GW.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What they used to call radios? Was there was there a different name, like,
Victrola.
well,
That was
record
a-
player,
that was a
yeah.
record player.
RCA, you know, but, yeah. My wife still wants to call soda pop.
I still will.
What's wrong with that?
It's Coke. That's what's wrong
Exactly,
with it.
it's a
Coke.
I call
Even if it's Dr. Pepper,
It's
it's
Coke.
Still a
I call the refrigerator.
Okay,
I call the refrigerator the ice box.
ice box.
I still
Yeah.
do that myself.
Yeah. Why, how many of you have glove boxes in your automobiles? Why are they called a glove box?
That's where you store your gloves way back when.
What, in what?
The old Model T.
And the sleighs. And why is it in the back you got a trunk?
It's where you
Back
put
in
your-
Where you put the dead bodies.
Because used to with a wagon, it was literally, and the early automobiles, it was actually a trunk strapped on to
To
the
the
back
wagon.
of the automobile.
I've never figured out the boot. English boot.
Yeah, for the boot and then the bonnet
Yeah. The bonnet is your motor.
to cover the.
Bonnet makes more sense than the boot.
Yeah, so, but then again, if you were, okay,
There's a good
example, because you get a lot of Stan Mitchell stuff, right?
Uh-huh.
And when he was in New Zealand, you know, he talks about, you know, that you go to New Zealand, And you go into somebody's home and you say, "Can I use your bathroom?" Why? Do you want to take a bath? It's not a bathroom. It's a loo. Well, it's a loo in England. Down there it may just be the restroom, you know, whatever. But it's not a bathroom. See? But you know, you find out what your audience understand, okay? So now, are we understanding that? Okay, one thing. But here's the key. Here's the key. Let me go back and read that. The literal meaning of a word is that meaning which is given it by those to whom it is addressed. So, first century church, when they heard that message, those words were for them. In the Koine Greek, a little bit of Hebrew, a little bit of Aramaic. What did it mean to them? We got to figure out what it meant to them, because that's what the writers and the speakers, they were addressing them, right? What happens if you give an uncertain message? It's like a clanging cymbal, right? It's what Paul says, right? Like a clanging cymbal, right? But it presumes that the speaker-writer understands the audience, or that a communication feedback loop exists for explanation. That's why I always ask, do you have any questions? Do you understand? Now, if you don't understand and you don't ask, now whose fault is it? It's yours. I can bear some responsibility, but now you've had that opportunity to ask the question. Wait, I just don't understand, say. So, literal language. Are you good with literal language? So when Jesus said, except a man or a person be born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Is that literal or is that figurative?
That's literal.
Or is it a mixture of both? How did Nicodemus understand it? Can a man crawl back into his mother's womb and be born again?
That was literal.
He was thinking very literal, wasn't he? Now, it was literal in the sense you have to be born again, but it was figurative in the sense it's not what Nicodemus was thinking. It's a figure of speech for being spiritually born again. Okay, it's 7 after. I need to quit. But my time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? Thank you so much for your time and attention, class.